Okay. For people joining this live stream, this is continuing discussion about database integration in the upcoming version of Wolfram Language. So first up is a discussion of all kinds of names of functions related to this. And we have a proposal here for a variety of these names. Okay, so you're proposing something where we... Wow, okay. Well, let's discuss what some of these mean. Okay, so what you're proposing, entities, sorted entity class. So the main issue is that we want to make these nouns, right? So explain to me, for example, if I take this entity store, wherever it is, and then I want to, okay, so those are entity value things, but let's say I want to take this entity store, which hopefully this is running correctly here. No, why is that not working?
You didn't register it.
Okay. Let's see, where was that? Where was the registration?
Well, first, you have to evaluate that, yeah.
So wait a minute. So you always have to do that. You always have to make it into an entity store. And then we say entity register of that entity store. So we'd say here, entity register of that store. Okay, great. And it returns. Okay, so now you are proposing, and so now if I say entity value of person, great. Okay. Well, friends are just numbers for some reason. Okay, who knows why? Okay,
no, because those are the value of the thing on the database, the relation, the friend entities are called person-friend.
Okay, so what I could do right now would be entity sort by. And so if I say entity sort by, and I say person, comma, and then I say, is it hash friend?
No, it's just string friend.
Why?
It's a property. Could be entity property, but you don't need a function there.
But how about if I wanted to sort it by the, okay. So that would become sorted entity. Okay, so if I say entity sort by, and now I say entity value of that, comma, comma, what would I do? Full name, for example. Why did that work? Oh, why did that work that way? Why did that work that way? That should sort it by friend number, right? Oh, maybe it was already sorted.
No.
It was already sorted by friend.
It was kind of sorted. If you look at it, it's not exactly the same. Like the last one is different.
Okay, fine. So that's sorted by friend number. Okay, so your proposal is that would become a sorted entity class. So question for Michael and Tony, is that something we can support in the rest of our entity store framework?
Yes, all of these new database entity functions have a corresponding entity store and alpha implementation.
They already have it.
Well, the alpha side is evaluated, and then the alpha implementation is evaluated on the client side, but this is a detail. In principle, yes, they are all supported.
Okay, so do you support these new names here?
Well, they would be renamed at the same time for all backends.
No, I understand that. I'm asking you whether you like the new names.
I don't know.
Okay, so that's okay. So you have nothing to say about them, or you don't like them?
I don't have a good reason against them, but somehow I don't feel so good about them.
I mean, you could say that, the part on the ticket discussion, you can expand on that maybe, about entity class in the name.
So one of the proposed names is aggregated entity class or something like that. However, if you say entity list of that thing, then you can't do anything because we don't have a representation of the entities that come out of the aggregated entity class.
What is an aggregate? What is aggregated entity class here?
Imagine you can do something like aggregate country by continent, and then you have some aggregations, like you can get the average population or the maximum.
Why isn't that more like grouped entity class?
It's because the aggregation is the important feature here.
No,
so the
but,
fact that
you're doing it's like group by, isn't it?
Not quite, because it's similar to group by, but the most important feature here, and it's the one that it's not the only one that's not optional, is the aggregations that you do. So you can even say aggregate everything, and so that's the 2-argument version. If you look at the examples on the right, you get basically an entity class that contains one single entity, which is all together.
Wait a minute. Where did this? Is this what you typed in here, or did I?
You typed it in.
Okay, from last time.
Yeah. So there are 2 versions. One is like with 2 arguments, and one is with 3 arguments.
Are we talking about? Let's go back to them. Which one of these do you think is the most straightforward to look at?
I think probably select, sort, take are the easier to look at.
Okay, so this one you're proposing that it be called filtered. We've never used the word filtered entity class.
I think that filtered is better than selected, because select has a very precise and different meaning in SQL, and so this way nobody would get confused.
Yeah. Okay.
However, the word filter has been proposed for this property goes to predicate notation that we use in implicit entity classes. This would be something slightly different.
I'm not a big fan of filter, because one day when we do more advanced math, we need filters everywhere. In operator algebras and other things.
Right. Okay. So let's go back here and ask the question. So is entity class the right base for these names? What is
I think yes.
Okay, so fundamentally what all these things are doing is creating an entity class by some operation on an existing entity class, yes?
One or more.
Yeah.
Okay. So the principle here is we could summarize these as operations on entity classes. So what other operations on entity classes do we have? Do you understand my question?
Do you mean others than those listed above?
Yes, other than the ones that you're introducing, other ones that are, so, I'm sorry?
Wait, Stephen, I think one important thing is that these operations of entity class always return, they don't return, but symbolically represent a new entity class. And so there are operations that, like entity list or entity value, that actually perform some evaluation. And these are just basically, if you look at it algebraically, they go from the space of entity classes to the space of entity classes.
So what would we call them? They're not operations on, they're transformations.
And they all, except for join across, which would be entity merged.
Okay, so these are now. Then we have functions evaluated on entity classes. Is that correct?
Yes.
Which is a different thing, and those functions are entity value, entity list, and what else? And the entity property.
Well, that's entity value.
Yeah,
entity function, but that's also entity value really underneath.
No, let's look at entity function. Is entity function something that immediately evaluates or not?
Entity function behaves exactly like a property. So if you leave it alone, if you don't apply it to something.
Okay, so there's a different thing. These are immediately evaluating, right?
Yeah.
And then we have setting up a structure, which is entity function, right?
Entity function is really like if you have on one side of the of the algebra entity and entity class. On the other side, like the dual, is entity function, entity property, and entity property class, I guess. So
well,
it's
okay,
like,
so this is okay. So the point of this is it is analogous. It is a computed entity property, correct?
yes, exactly.
Okay. All right. So now we got these transformations on entity classes. So the first step is entity class itself, right? So if I say entity class, now what can I say here? So I say entity class of country, comma, G8, for example, right? That represents an entity class. So for example, if I say entity value of that, comma, population, I will get the population of the whole. No, I get that. So if I do this, so I have a function here. If I can say total there? Hello, Tony.
Yeah, you
Michael?
can, but it's like you can do it, but it's kind of a hack in a sense. I mean, the more proper way of doing it would be with aggregated entity class.
Okay, Michael and Tony, could you speak up, please?
Yes, I think this is a temporary syntax, not well documented. We should use entity aggregate or whatever that's called from now on.
Okay, so the form that you want to have here is entity. You would like it to say some. Can we try to prevent that echo? Okay, you are suggesting perhaps a name like aggregated entity class of. I'm not really a big fan of this and then population, right? You're suggesting that that's what that would look like, correct?
No, you need a second argument, Stephen. You need a second argument to aggregate an entity class, where you say something like total population goes to.
What are you talking about?
Yeah, first you have to say what you're aggregating and then how you call this aggregate property. And then you can repeat.
Ugh, that's horrible.
Yeah, but how else would
Okay,
it know?
so would you like to explain how do we do? Okay, so what we really want to be able to say is, aggregate by total. I mean, this is the other way around of what you're talking about. Is take that set of things, for this property, find the total. Or is it the case that what you say is that what we should be doing is to just say total of, but that then becomes a client-side computation, right?
Yep.
Okay, so what is the server-side version of that computation?
It would be entity value.
Let me see if I can figure it out. Let me see if I can figure it out, because what you're saying is that then you say it would be an entity function. Is that right?
No.
Okay, tell me how to do it then.
Okay, entity value of, now it's called entity aggregate of G8. And then comma. No. You have to wrap entity aggregate around G8.
Okay. Yes, comma.
Then total population as a string.
That's something I'm making up now?
Yep.
Oh, for God's sake. No, this is a total mess. Go on.
It goes to.
Yeah.
Entity function.
Oh, for goodness sake. You can't be serious. Okay, go on.
Then C, comma C, total of C population.
Where's the population word? C.
It's applied to C, yeah.
Okay, so that's a joke. And then I have to then say, comma, total population there, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a joke. Right? So what do we actually have to do to get this to work?
Stephen, may I have a comment here? I think that what you want to do is a convenient shortcut in cases where you have, for example, just one property and the aggregator is something simple. And what this is
Yeah,
a generic.
I understand that. I want to know, how do we do the thing that people actually want to do? Right? How do we do the simple thing? Because what you're currently proposing doesn't solve that problem.
I mean,
right? So how would we solve that problem? You know, we've got a collection here of functions, right, which are pretty low-level database operations. These involve.
There is a shorter version of that, if you want.
Go ahead. What is it?
Entity value.
Yeah.
Of G8.
Yeah.
And then you can say entity property, country, comma population, comma total.
Okay.
This is less of a hack.
Okay. Does Tony think that's a hack or not?
So the empty list is missing before the total, because in the third argument we have qualifiers, in this case no qualifiers, and then total. Yes, it is very unintuitive in some sense, because
also, I think it also
so too. Okay, so listen, reality check, guys. Okay, you know, database programming is typically a total mess. You know, it's typically done, it typically involves these, you know, elaborate join operations that are frankly quite hard for most people to understand. And, you know, it typically ends up with junk like this. What we need to do is to get beyond and above this. So, you know, we've got some distance there, but I think this makes it clear that we haven't solved the problem yet.
So, I think that, I mean, see, and honestly, I think that this, if you want to do database programming, there is one good reason why people have big, complicated things in one go, and that's atomicity. Like, if you optimize for one-liners, you will never get atomic results out.
Why?
That's why you want to do things.
Why? I don't understand that statement. I don't understand that at all.
Okay, suppose you're querying a database that changes every millisecond.
Yep.
If you get out the total with one-liner, then you do a completely different thing. That's another one-liner. Mm-hmm. You end up with data that is inconsistent. I don't
understand why you say that. Why isn't there atomicity with whatever whatever query you're making, right, should be atomic?
Yeah, but if you don't give people the possibility of getting together the total population and the mean population, then you get two things that are out of sync.
Oh, okay. You know what? This argument is such a crock, if I might say so. I mean, your argument is that give people unbelievably convoluted, syntax in order that we don't have to solve the problem of getting, if they ask for the total and the mean together, that we don't have to solve the problem of getting that atomically. Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is that, do you want people to use this for doing database programming, or do you want it for people to ask people to actually one number as the answer?
I want people to actually use it, which means it needs to do better. That, frankly, they could be using SQL for a lot of this stuff. By the time
absolutely, SQL is a great language.
Yeah, well, so why aren't we just why do we do this project? Why don't we just give them database link and be done with it?
Because there are a bunch of things that are complicated to get into the system after. Like you execute the SQL and you get a bunch of stuff out that doesn't have data.
Okay, so this is our objective. Our objective is to make something that people, that doesn't involve this kind of convoluted nonsense. Okay, so let's try to figure out what you're doing right now is building an intermediate layer between SQL and the level of polish that we like to have. It will get some distance, but it's not getting all the way.
No, Stephen, I completely disagree. I think, if you want shorthand syntaxes, we can add them later. But we need to give people tools.
I want to understand what they are.
They can do things.
I understand. That's what I'm saying.
We haven't done that so far.
Okay,
there are so many things that you cannot do with entity class because, we haven't even thought about how to do OR with entity class.
Okay. Well, fine. What I'm saying to you is you're building an intermediate level here, and let's get that as clean as we can, but let's think about how we build something that actually will solve the final problem. So let's look at this case, okay, as an example, and see what we would like this to look like. Okay?
What I think, Stephen, is that you're aiming towards removing the intermediate total population from the game in the case of a single aggregation.
Yes, that's what I would like to do.
And that's probably possible.
Okay, well, let's think about how to do it for a second as an example. Okay. So what you're suggesting is this aggregated entity class, okay, does it represent, I mean, it's a kind of a weird construct, because what you're saying is what you really want is to aggregate only in this one property, because you don't really want to say, unless
that's what you're doing. That's what you're doing. You only agree on the properties. The others get lost. That aggregated entity class has only one property, and that's total population.
Okay, fine. But the fact that you have to name, I don't really understand what an aggregated entity class is if it's only about one property. It doesn't seem like.
I mean, if you put a third argument, first of all, the second argument can be a list. And other than that, you can put a third argument and aggregate over something.
Okay, so what you're doing in these cases is you're basically generating intermediate keys in the database. This thing, total population, is, you're not having a symbolically named thing. So, for example, one could say, that aggregated entity class was, one could imagine something. Let's see. The aggregated identity class has one property. Is that correct? Total, which is total population. Is that what you're doing?
In this case, yes.
Okay, fine. I don't know. Seems like the wrong way around to do this.
One thing you could do is that we could make a shorthand that is comma total goes to population, and that doesn't ruin the property.
Well, okay. So let's imagine we did that. Okay. Or population goes to total or something.
Oh, population goes to, yeah, maybe. Maybe population goes to total is better, yeah.
Right. Yeah, Seth Chandler on our live stream comments on, leveraging the data set query syntax for this stuff. To what extent are we doing that here?
I think we decided, Stephen, to do that later, because right now we decided to expose databases through the entity front end, but we have intermediate layer and plans to later support dataset query syntax as well.
Can we in fact do that?
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, most of the operations you can do in dataset you cannot do on a database, because its dataset is hierarchical, and the database you always have to deal with things that are in first normal form, and that's also what entity class does. So that's good.
And by the way,
it is an easier match.
And by the way, Stephen, I just wanted to remind you that like a year and a half ago, at the very start of this project, I actually already did a short demo where I was compiling small subset of dataset operations to that. So it's very possible.
Yeah, I mean, look, to my mind, the way this should work is, some dataset operations are compilable, some are not. If they compile, fantastic. If they don't compile, people can be told, whoops, this isn't going to compile, it's going to work on the client side. You got to download a bunch of data and do it on the client side. And so long as we can message that properly, I think it will be fine.
Yeah, I just think we decided that we support that after version 1.
Okay, well, so long as we don't have an incompatible, I'd like to understand that syntax so we don't have something incompatible. I mean, how do you imagine that would work? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we already saw it working. The only thing that gave real issue where I had to extend dataset language was the join and like relational lookup.
Okay, so hold on a second. So what you're saying is, given this entity store, right? And this is a question for Tony also, right? Given this entity store here, right? You're saying that you could then do dataset like queries on that entity store. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. In principle,
okay, so give me an example of what one might do there.
Well, for example, you can do something like select and then of some criteria, like let's say, yeah. But the thing is, Stephen, you can't do it on the entity store directly. You have to choose the data set first. Like, for example, a person. So you say entity store of person or something like that. And then on that, you can do that.
So what does entity store of person do right now?
I don't think it does anything like that. Like
Well,
right
what
now.
does it do? Tony, can you speak up, please?
Well, there's no documented behavior for that.
Okay. And what would you expect that to do? I mean, the issue with the entity store is a graph, basically, of relations. Is that right?
Right.
And
so for now, there are some basic operations supported. I mean, each entity store, whatever you can do with entity value, you can swap an entity store in there, and some basic operations do work. So like of entity, comma, property.
okay, so entity value of this thing. Wait a second. What are you saying here? So you're saying if I were to index the entity store by an entity by an entity name, is that right?
No, basically, if you have a call like entity value of entity one, comma, property one, then you can replace that entity value head with an actual entity store, and it should still work if the entities are in that store.
Seth Chandler on our live stream is making a suggestion here for, let's see.
But Stephen, one thing I think the correct thing here would be to create a data set that is backed by a single type in the entity store. Like have a constructor data set of that, and then
yes,
use.
I agree.
So
that's
what
I would think. Yes. So it looks like something like this, where that takes some slice of the entity store. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, and the second argument could be person or something like that. So that
well, what would that mean? What would that mean? What would that mean? Would that mean to sort the entity store so that the first level of the data set is person, or what?
No, that means that you have entity store as a collection of data sets. Each data set corresponds to a single type.
But wait a second, you lose relations this way.
You only lose that if you don't extend the data set query syntax by relation operations.
No, what I mean is that if you construct the data set only with person, how does person know about transaction?
Yeah, I mean, that data set, because it's constructed from the entity store, it obviously contains the entire entity store information.
And then why do you need to construct it with person as well? Just construct it with the entity store, and then first you have to peel a level out to get to person.
Because the data set, like the rectangular data set, aligns best with a single table, not with a collection of tables.
Well, then you have a data set that's hierarchically 3 rectangular ones.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that given that the other things we're doing, at least for relational world, is all tables, that extra level and making that data set hierarchical doesn't make much sense because...
No, but it does. It does, because
Why?
we're trying to map it. Okay, Tony, can you say what you imagine the mapping from entity stores to data sets is?
I don't have an opinion. That's more relational.
I mean, like 95% of that is like single tables connected through relations. So why would we want to connect a single data set from entity store? I think it will just complicate everything.
Well, so what are you proposing? That we'd be able to do queries directly on the entity store?
No, I propose that we will extend the syntax of a data set through a few operations such as relational lookup, basically. And then you make queries on a single data set of, say, person, but if it needs to fetch something from another data set, it will just look it up. And because it was constructed from the entity store, it will know what to do.
Well, I don't fully understand that, but let's loop back to the original question that we had here. Okay, so we're trying to define these things, which I understand are, let's look at our example here, wherever it was, are basically modified versions of the entity store, are transformations on the entity store, representing pieces of the entity store transformed in some way, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, in a sense, yes.
Well, no. I want to be clear. Is that correct or is that not correct?
Well, an entity store is a collection of entity classes, basically, or entity types, really.
It's a collection of entity types, and the entity types may have entity classes.
I mean, each entity type has a trivial entity class, which is just entity class of the name, comma, all.
Okay. By the way, somebody's asking on a live stream, can you put entities into a data set? Yes, that works just fine. Okay, so what this is asking for, again, is these are trying to represent various kinds of rearrangements, virtual rearrangements of the entity store. That is, there is a direct way of accessing the entity store and doing operations on it, such as entity value and entity list, right? The concept here is to transform the entity store or transform classes to create. What is it really doing? Is it creating, I mean, is it really transforming the entity store?
No, yeah, it's not transforming the store. The store stays as it is.
I know it stays as it is. But
but still, it never operates on the whole entity store. It operates on one or two classes from the entity store.
Okay, so the concept is then, I mean, I don't understand why it couldn't operate on the whole entity store, but
because these are class level operations. It's like there are entity class level operation, entity level operation, entity property level operation.
What's an example of an entity level operation?
Dated, I think we have stuff like that.
Okay, wait a minute. So okay, so hold on. So these are modifiers. Okay, so we've got a separate thing as modifiers to properties, right? Of which you say dated is one example.
Yeah.
Well, dated is just a shortcut for the date qualifier of properties.
Okay. Okay, so now let's go back here. So you say
I would say that entity group is an entity level modifier. It takes a bunch of entities and returns a single entity.
Entity level modifier. Okay. Now, I know that Michael and Tony have to go at the top of the hour, and we really need to. Okay, let's continue here. Okay, so we're saying these are things which create, in a sense, a virtual entity class on which operations can be done. Is that correct?
Except you killed entity list.
I'm sorry, what are you talking about?
You decided not to have entity list work on these.
Why not?
Because, I mean, they can't be easily represented as string types. So basically, if you do entity lists, or say an aggregated entity class where you aggregate countries by continent, then you will get aggregates that are indexed by continent.
So what?
And so the problem is that the first argument would have to be something that is not a string.
So what?
And I don't know. I like this.
What first argument? I don't understand. So hold on a second. So the concept here, the principle would be these return essentially virtual, entity classes. Is that right?
Right. Yeah.
On which you can do entity value and entity list.
Stephen, I think disagreement was on the level of single entities. And what you didn't like were single entities with complex first arguments.
Okay. But that's not what we're talking about here.
I mean,
that's exactly what we're talking
argument of an aggregated entity class, of aggregated entities from an aggregated entity class that was aggregated on some property.
Sorry, say that again.
Okay, imagine you aggregate the countries by some property, or maybe even some entity function. So where the by, the third argument, is something. Now, what is the type of this? What is the entity type of this?
Okay, so let's look at your case that you're talking about. So you're saying entity in the current way, entity aggregate. What are you saying here?
Country, then something like population goes to total.
Like this?
Yeah, and then comma continent. So
Okay.
here,
Now what do I do with this? Tell me what to do next.
I mean, this wouldn't work because you use the shorthand population total. But
okay, so if I put in all this nonsense,
yes.
okay, so
Then
I'm
you can
gonna
do
put that in.
then you can get total population out of it by way
Okay,
of
so then tell me what to do next.
open at the end. Open square bracket, open string, total population.
Okay. Like
Execute.
that?
Yep.
Okay. So now what's this doing?
So
I
basically,
understand it's getting the results by continent, but now what's the problem here?
So there are
the problem is, yeah, what if you do entity list instead of this, what do you get out?
If I do entity list instead of total population there.
Yes.
Yeah, so there are some objects, new objects that have these values. And the question
what might this do?
I mean, I think it should return a list of, I don't know, 7 entities where the first argument is the query itself, comma, Europe, America, and whatnot. Okay,
so wait a minute. Because the problem is that this is a type. What is the problem here? The problem is that this type of entity, why isn't this, I see, continent, no, explain the point.
I mean, in this case, you could technically say it's continent, though it's not because it doesn't have the same properties. But imagine you aggregated on something which is like, I don't know, you rounded the population to the nearest million and you aggregated by that. That's something that doesn't even have a name.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so then what?
So then what's the type of that? What's the type of those entities? Those are entities that have actually only 2 properties. One is total population and the other one is the
I understand. So these are virtual entities, basically.
Yes. And so the question is, you have no big problem with virtual entities. The problem that we ran into is that whether the first argument should somewhat simplify when you do something like that. So like right now, when we do entity list of entity class, even if you had filters in the entity class, that returns entities of the type.
This isn't actually correct. I mean, what the actual correct thing here is entity. Oh, I see. This is
that would be entities. XXX Europe. You would have at there. You would have.
Yeah. Right. That's the point. So you're saying this is an extended, instead of that being entity of country, it is a decorated country because it's actually.
It's not a country. It doesn't have the same.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
So the issue then, okay, so Tony, if we were to introduce sort of symbolically represented sort of virtual entity types, so this calls for basically virtual entity types. Is that correct?
Yeah, but the main problem that we have is that currently the way entity class works with filters is that it somewhat simplifies the first argument if it can.
What do you mean?
That it's like, if you say, I want the entity class of G8. G8 will not appear in the first argument.
Okay, can we get, I know Tony has to go, so can we please get some feedback from him on this, unless he already left?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, so, can you give some feedback on this, please?
So my point is that Europe, in this case, it's a string, so it still looks nice, but continent could be anything, and there could be multiple aggregates. So we basically would allow arbitrary expressions in the second argument of entity.
In the first argument.
In the second argument.
As well as the first argument, both arguments.
Yes, and the first argument too. So that means that will be a complicated design process. And the question is, when
I'm sorry, why is there complicated design? I don't understand. What's the complexity here? You know, we have to decide how to print it.
The first argument and the second argument of entity will have to correspond in some way. And if you start nesting aggregates and joins, that might become complicated. Yeah.
But you know that I've already solved this problem, because since you can register a complex query, then that just works.
Complex entity type, you mean? You can register a complex
you can register any type of these class-like things as a new entity type. And so I already solved that problem. It comes out as a list and there's a clear order of evaluation that tells you what part of the list means what. We had also designed something called entity ID, which took an association with the fully qualified properties inside, so there was no confusion as to what it was doing. I mean, we had proposed multiple solutions. The things we really got stuck on is that when we do entity list on something that is filtered somehow, should we keep the filter in the first argument of the resulting entities or not? That's what's the thing.
And what's the argument? I mean, look, the print form is one thing. Keeping that structure there, it seems like there's no way out of that.
Yes.
You agree that there's no way out of it?
Yes, and that was our original proposal to you in the first place, that we keep the structure as it is. But then the problem is that, if I remember correctly, Tony had the idea that in some cases, like if you have just a filter, you can argue that this is still the same type, which I don't think is correct, but there are arguments for it and against it.
Wait, but that's a detail. That does not affect this design. By the way, what on earth is this result? What continent has 3,000 people if it isn't Antarctica? And then if that's the case, what continent is missing?
Greenland, maybe.
It's not a continent.
Oh, just put the list total population continent in there, instead of just total population, and you will see in the. Yeah.
Yes. What the heck is that? Well, that's a data.
Oh, it's all the countries that don't have a continent. So they are aggregated as missing, which I think is incorrect.
Well, but that's a question for the aggregator, isn't it?
I mean, I think that missing is really a special value. And the fact that we actually propagate it weirdly in operations is like, if you do a total and there are 3 missings, they get added as 3 times missing, which is.
Okay, but that's okay. There's something to look at, but all right, fine. Okay, so let's go back. Michael and Tony, do you have to leave? Hello?
Yeah. So what I was saying is that one problem that we have is that we have a precedent for entity class of stripping some of these filters away. Because when you do entity class of an implicit entity, then the resulting entities are of type, say, country. They're not of type entity class country.
When you do implicit entities. So you're saying if I say entity.
Yeah, type it.
Okay, so I say entity, country, population.
No, Stephen, say entity list. Yeah, not entity, entity list. Entity class, sorry, entity class. And then entity list of that.
So what are you saying? You're saying entity
population greater than 1 billion.
Well, okay, so greater than. Okay, and then you want me to say, so this entity class is just a class. I find this thing rather confusing. And I think we should this should be more decorated because it's unclear it did anything here. I mean, again, this is an unevaluated object. And so now I can say entity list of that, right? And now if I want to get the total population.
Yeah, wait a second. These 2 entities are of type country.
Yes.
They forgot that there ever was a filter on them. That's the whole discussion point.
Well, that's good that they forgot that, because that way we can compare them with other things. If they've got a bunch of filter crud in them, that's not going to work.
But still, on the other hand, imagine that there is a country which is just about to join this club, which is just the borderline population. And then yesterday it was still filtered out, and today someone else was born and it's now in this list.
Yes.
So the point is, if you're
right, so we want to do evaluation, like, it's the same thing for any of these things. There's a moment at which it's evaluated, and there's a structure that can be reevaluated. Am I making sense?
Yeah, but
so don't confuse those two. I mean, you've got to be able to actually get results.
Yes, but still, on the other hand, when you are determining the existence of the entity, what this means is that that country technically stops existing in, like, it doesn't yet exist in this entity list because it's not yet there, and then it will exist there after someone else is born.
Okay, let me put it this way. Imagine you have a list of customers who haven't paid you, that still owe you money. You get out the entity list, and then you want to know the amount that they owe you. If you do this in 2 steps and you forget about the filter, you will add people that have paid you in the meantime.
Okay, guys, look, both cases are relevant, right? Both cases are relevant. Both you freeze it, then you compute from it, and you maintain the thing unevaluated. Both cases are desirable. So let's make sure we can support both cases. Am I making sense?
But Stephen, it was not exactly the point we were trying to make.
Wait, no, but
so what you're saying is that we should have entity list and entity list simplify.
No, I'm saying you could have something which is like your collection of functions up here that don't actually do anything, right? At some point you have to resolve and do something, right? So there's a class of functions, right, which we can think of as transformation functions, which don't actually do anything, right? There's a transformation function, and there's essentially what we might call a resolution function.
Yeah, the main problem is that really entity list does partial resolution. And the question is, well, really,
I don't know. I mean, let's not address that issue right now. Okay, entity list is its own separate thing. Let's address. Okay, what does entity list not resolve?
What?
Why don't we just decide that the resolution functions are entity value and entity list?
Yeah, but the question is, how much does entity list resolve?
As much as it can.
As much as it can would be to go down to the entity property association, basically.
No, no, that's not right. It resolves as much as it can without, while maintaining. So your point is that in entity list, that you might have an aggregated entity whose aggregator is still a symbolic aggregator, right?
Yes.
Right. So the point here is entity list might end up with a symbolically defined entity.
Yeah, but the point is that also that if you do entity list on an entity class with a filter, you can resolve the filter right away. If the filter is nested within the aggregation, there's no way to resolve it.
Yes, I got it. I understand the point. Right. So entity list. So to my mind, so long as we indicate to the user what's going on, we're in good shape. That is, there are some things where, you end up with a symbolic variable, and there are other ones where you end up with numbers like 3, right? And people can tell the difference between 3 and a symbolic variable. And so similarly here, you're saying entity list might resolve all the way to just, to pure, sort of invariant entities, pure entities, or it might end up with something which has some, let's say pure, why am I thinking of fixed stars? But, pure entities that are fixed for all time versus...
There is no such thing in the SQL world as things that are fixed for all time.
Well, whatever, it doesn't matter. They resolve to pure entities, or they resolve to things that have some symbolic structure left in them.
Yeah,
I think that's fine.
But my claim is that we'd better have 2 functions for this.
No, I don't think so.
But how do you distinguish between the version, like, what if you don't want any simplification?
Okay, fine. Okay, that I agree with, right? So that I agree with. So in the transformation collection, right, these are resolution functions. They resolve as far as they can, okay? Now, you are defining a collection of transformation functions which do not resolve. They just sit there providing something which at the moment of resolution would be resolved. Am I making sense?
Yes, in some part.
I'm sorry, what part doesn't make sense?
No, I mean, what I'm saying is that this resolution is has to be partial for entity list. I mean, even the fact that you're returning an entity means that you haven't completely resolved, because that's still
fine.
an
Okay,
indirection.
so the rule is resolution functions resolve as far as they can when they are called. Okay, so entity value similarly might return 3 or it might return an entity, right? But it resolves as far as it can when they are called. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Whereas transformation functions do nothing. Transformation functions merely build structure, right? These return virtual entity classes that are merely symbolic structures and do no evaluation.
Okay,
Correct?
now can you go up to the list of new symbols?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so these symbols are all different. So sort by and select can be resolved. Aggregate, join can't. Take can. Extend can't. Extend thread can't.
Okay, what do you mean by can be resolved? So you're saying...
it means that they can be stripped from the first argument.
Of what?
Of entity.
Okay, so you're saying entity list could resolve them?
Yes, could resolve the first argument.
Okay, so let's take these functions again, okay? And let's go down here. Okay. Okay, so you're saying the first of these, let's call it sorted entity class. You're saying that entity list is capable of resolving that. So entity list of a sorted entity class would end up with a list of entities, correct? Sorted and
that's not the difference. All of them can end up with a list of entities.
Okay, so what's the issue?
So if you have sorted entity class of 2 arguments, you end up with a list of entities that can have the first argument.
Okay, so let's just understand what's inside sorted entity class. So sorted entity class would have an entity class here that might be our G8 countries, for example, correct? Yes, and then the sorting criterion is represented how?
Either a property or an entity function.
Yeah.
Or a rule, if you want to name the entity function.
Okay, so let's imagine it's by population here. Okay, I'm not sure I'm totally bought into that syntax, but let's assume it's that.
Okay, if you do that, then you could, in principle, return for this entity country Italy, entity country China, whatnot.
Yep. I agree. That's what you should do. So, okay, so now what's the next case? So the next case is something where you do not believe you can resolve in the same way. Give me an example of that.
The entity aggregate. So entity aggregate.
So that was aggregated
entity class.
Entity class. Okay, so let's look at that case. Okay, so so aggregated entity class. So give me an example here. So now, hold on. So I've got the entity class. Do I start off with an entity class G8, for example, here? Is that correct?
Yes? Yeah, well, if you do that, you're already in trouble. But yeah.
Okay. Well, okay, so let me get in trouble. That's fine. Okay, so what's the second argument to aggregated entity class?
Then it would be something like population goes to total.
So what does that mean?
That means that this is what you have to do on the properties.
No. No, I'm not asking that. I want to know, okay, what is the function? So this function here, right, is ultimately a sort by of blah, comma. In this case, it will be hash of population, correct? That's what that's ultimately doing. Yeah. Right?
I mean, in aggregated, it's a little bit more complicated because it's like it can be written with group by, but it's not exactly group by because group by is hierarchical and this isn't.
Well, we need to understand that, and maybe it isn't quite the right function, but okay. But in this case, this is sort by like this, right? It's a little bit unclear to me why. Okay, and this is a shorthand syntax for that, right? Is this a complicated case, or is there an intermediate case which is not as complicated as aggregated that we could look at?
I think aggregate is the first non-trivial one. Okay. Well, no, entity extend actually is simpler. Entity extend.
Okay, what is your new proposed name for that?
extended entity class.
All right, let's take a look at that. Okay, so what would extended entity class do here? So are we giving it, we're giving it...
You give it, say, country, or entity class country G8 if you want.
Let's do that. Okay, then what?
And then you would take a name, let's say density.
Okay.
And that would go to entity function of C, comma, C population divided by C area.
Okay, so extended entity class is then, so now, for example, one thing I could do with this extended entity class, I see. So now let's imagine that I do entity list of that.
Okay, then in this case, you have to keep.
I understand. So in this case, the entities that I get out here are not pure countries. They're not pure G8 countries, right? They're G8 countries that have been extended by having this extra property, right?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. All right. So let's think about how we represent that. Okay. So I mean, don't we need some new construct here?
But not really, because if you think about it, like a type and an entity class are kind of the same structure algebraically. They operate the same way when you apply a property to them.
Well, okay, so right now we have an entity here, France, for example, right? And what you are proposing is that this first argument,
it should just be a query.
Is that really an entity? Okay, so the query means this thing here, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, but is that really an entity?
In algebraically, yes, because if you apply a property, you get a scalar.
Okay, or more to the point. So you're making the, okay, so question, what is the difference between, what is the difference between entity types and entity classes? Because that's in the entity type position. And it is not the case that I can say right now, entity, I don't believe, at least entity of entity class, country G8, comma France. That doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
Mean anything.
Doesn't work, but it means something.
Does it? How does it know?
We can make it mean something.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that this
I don't think so. I don't think so. In this case, you can, because this is anchored by. Oh gosh, I wish.
No, but it's the same thing, Stephen. This would be just like France. But if you write entity of entity class of country G8, comma Burundi, then you get missing unknown entity.
No. I think you're being. I think you're not thinking. Look.
Also,
look at
Stephen,
this.
There is one good example here. You know that Carlo made it possible to work with the computed entity classes, where you just say string goes to and then the query. So that string is a type.
Types, not class.
Yes. Yeah. So the thing is, there is no fundamental difference between entity types and entity classes.
Okay. Well, let me come back here. Okay. This entity, which you have named France, I don't think you can name entities that way when you have a more complicated entity type specifier here. This is purely a hack for this case because this thing is a mere extension of the country entity type.
Yeah, but we had a proposal which is very general how you can make this naming work.
How?
Yeah, there are basically two positions, two ways, 3 ways actually. One is that we get like some kind of association, probably with some symbol around it, because otherwise it would break implicit entities. And we use basically property goes to the value. So there's no ambiguity. Another way is to make it hierarchical, and another way yet is to flatten the hierarchical version. The version I currently have is flattened hierarchical in the entity store for when you register computed types.
No, but you're not addressing my issue. My issue is, by the time you've got one of these aggregated entity classes, right, you no longer have a naming, well, maybe you are addressing this issue.
No, yeah, I have a naming convention internally. I mean, the question is whether it's user-friendly enough. If it's not user-friendly enough, we can make it into an association, so it's very clear what it is.
You know, I have to say, my feeling is that we should have a notion of what we might call an extended entity. Okay? Because I think we're going to get into trouble trying to put all this computed stuff into our current entity structure. And my suggestion would be that an extended entity, maybe that isn't the right name, is something which can take both in its entity type and its entity identifier, it can take arbitrary computed things. And an extended entity, were it to resolve to a simple entity that is a base entity in entity stores that we have, you know, built in or user provided, it would then turn into that base entity, just as, you know, something like, I don't know, some mathematical function of something, if it turns out it's pi squared over 6, you know, zeta of 2, if it turns out it's, you know, because it's pi squared over 6, it resolves into that. Zeta of 3 does not.
I don't think it's a good idea to have implicit evaluation of this stuff. I think it would be better to have an explicit operation that does the simplification, but yeah, why not? And maybe we can call it something like computed entity, and that thing is this complex beast with the complex first argument. And then you can say something like entity simplify and see if it can peel off something out of it. Maybe it can't.
I don't think well, fine. I don't know whether it should be on demand or automatic. I have a feeling it's going to need to be automatic.
I think it's dangerous to I mean, it's very important that entities are symbolic signifiers and they don't have evaluation semantics. I mean, we can add double equal semantics. That would be fairly easy and fairly useful to know whether an extended entity is equal to an entity.
Oh, in some sense, since entity list is a resolver, that could be a place where you apply certain simplifications, but not to the entities themselves.
Seth on our live stream is commenting that he thinks that most of the things we're talking about could be mapped onto the dataset framework, and he doesn't understand what we're doing here adds to that. Maybe there's a quick way to describe that.
Okay, I think that the advantage of this over the dataset is that dataset is somewhat eager in evaluation. In this case,
you can not a good enough answer. That's not a good enough answer to introduce some whole giant structure just for the sake of that.
Well, another answer, Stephen, is that still we can work here with single entities, even though we are now struggling with design. But in the data set, you can't do that. You can only work with data set and data set. So I think single entities, the existence of single entities as a separate object is the biggest issue here, the biggest deal.
So I'm sorry. So what you're saying is, let me try to understand that. I mean, the fact is, data set is fundamentally an array-like object. You know,
yes.
List of associations, whatever.
Yeah.
What this is fundamentally an entity store type object, which is a collection of, you know, entity property values. It does not have the same hierarchical structure as dataset. But the question is whether the dataset query language, I mean, who here thinks that they fully understand the dataset query language? Do you all understand it properly or not?
I understand it fairly well.
I never understood it.
Okay, well, that's not a good sign.
I understood it fairly well because I worked with it internally.
Okay.
By the way, I think that one thing where the data set will come to a grinding halt is mutability.
In its current form, yes. But there were suggestions about making mutable data sets. They just didn't go anywhere.
Okay, look, I want to come back to this and the understanding that we have here, right? So what we're talking about is this notion of transformations versus resolutions, okay? And the issue is okay, so one of the questions is, when you have a resolver that is fed things that cannot be resolved, what does it do? Right? Like entity list is a resolution function, but you might feed it something which simply cannot be resolved, down to literals, so to speak. Am I making sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think as a personal preference, I would really use more a function that entity list that doesn't try to resolve all the way down, but just resolves clearly one level. Because I find it confusing that you have some things that can be resolved, some things that can't, tries best effort, then sometimes it's
well, okay, it's different uses for different purposes. I mean, then in your world, the only resolver function is entity value. Is that correct?
Well, not necessarily. It would be useful sometimes to get single entities. But
then tell me how you would get that.
No, but imagine you have something that is like, let's say, computed entity list that returns computed entities and doesn't try to resolve anything. And so
I know, but I want to know the answer to the question of, at the end you have to resolve. Okay.
Yeah. At the end you always resolve with entity.
What function do you want to use to do that resolution?
But Stephen, that function is always entity value in any case.
No. I asked you the question. How do you want to resolve? You say sometimes you want to resolve to an entity, Stephen, not to an entity value.
What I'm saying is this. Imagine I want to do some kind of entity list, which is not entity list, and return fully dressed computed entities with weird stuff in the first argument. Then I look at them and I like copy paste 3 of them, and then I apply entity value to that. That's useful. That's like, imagine you want to give some of your customers a discount.
I understand. I got that. Right. But the question I'm asking is, are you saying that in your world that the only resolver function is entity value?
But that's already the case.
No, it's not already the case.
Yes, it is the case, because
is already a resolver function.
Entity list. Imagine you write a notebook, you take it back 5 years later, a country stopped existing, then you get an entity that's not valid. Then that's not.
No, that's not the point I'm making. That's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is right now, there are eager functions, right? So there are functions that you're proposing. These transformation functions are basically infinitely lazy functions, right? They just produce a symbolic structure. They don't try and resolve anything, right?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay. So now what I'm saying is, right now, entity list is an ego function that attempts to resolve things, right? Correct?
Yeah.
It has to some extent.
But it never does it fully. Because
I don't care. Yeah. Its goal is to resolve it as far as it can. True or not true?
True.
Okay.
And
right.
And my point is that in my world, I would also need something that resolves just one step.
I get it. I mean, so you're proposing that it is not resolve just one step. It is not a resolution function. You want a transformation function that makes a list.
No, it's partially resolving still, because just in order to get a list of entities, you still need to at least get the names.
The canonical names. So it needs to call the backend.
Okay. All right. Okay. So that's a tricky case, but for the time being, let's imagine that entity list is an infinitely resolving function. Maybe you're right. Maybe that it's sufficient. It may be that every use that we have today could be captured by having a one-level resolving entity list function. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And in fact, there is another thing which I don't know if we discussed already or not, but we could even register some queries at runtime so that they have string names if they are complicated for the users. Why not?
I mean, sure. Technically, we do that with computed.
Yes,
that's what extended entity does.
Yes, but my point is that as every time when you're getting some complicated looking first argument of an entity, an option would be to just register this query so that it will look simple if people prefer that.
Look, I think this idea, this would be an unresolved, an entity with arbitrarily complex, unresolved stuff in its type or its name or its identity.
No, not in its name. In its name, it resolves. Because you need the names. You need to say continent goes to Europe.
No,
So
that won't work. That the whole
what do you
point
mean
is
that won't work? How do you get a list out if you don't know what the continents are?
Okay, let's go through this again. Okay. This is okay. Well, okay. So I don't understand this necessarily. I don't understand that part. I think
Okay,
something in the identifier as well.
Stian, write this entity value.
Yep.
Of class.
Class. The word class.
Yeah, just the symbol class.
Like that.
Yeah, comma, like lowercase. It's not like it's variable. Class, comma, canonical name.
Okay.
Canonical name is a string. Sorry.
Okay.
And then map on this entity of class hash.
What are you saying? What
entity open square bracket class comma hash close square bracket ampersand map. This is basically what entity list does, except it simplifies class. So entity list is implemented on top of entity value. So it's a partial resolver in that sense.
Yeah.
So the point is whether class in the first argument of entity should be the same class as the one in entity value.
Thinking. So I mean, my inclination would be, yeah, the question is whether entity itself can be overloaded to have random CRUD in its first argument. Are you saying that it wouldn't ever have CRUD in its second argument?
Second argument we can make it be at most a list.
Why? What would it be a list of?
A list of so basically there is a scheme in which you construct the primary key out of the query, basically. So it's fairly simple because, for example, as soon as you have an entity aggregate, then the third argument of the aggregate is the properties that form the canonical name. I mean, I have
quite understand that. Okay, let's just go through the aggregated entity class for a second and what it does. Okay, so first is, what is the definition of aggregated entity class? So it takes an entity class, and what is it going to do? So remember, our definition of the sorted entity class is it is related to sort by of this. This is the defining, operation, basically. So tell me, what's that?
Yeah, I mean, I sent you the code to implement entity aggregate in some notebook maybe 6 months ago, but it can be written on top of sort by. It's just that
you don't mean sort by. You mean
sorry, group by.
Okay, so we need defining code for this, just so we understand it.
Yeah, I can fish it.
Okay, but you think it is roughly okay? So
maybe if you can look in that folder, you have it. It was called something like association equivalent, or something like that. So it's
okay.
All the versions of these.
Maybe Andrea can look. Okay, so just explain then, as they say in your own words, what does aggregated entity class do?
So aggregate entity class first groups by the third argument,
Okay,
if
so wait a
absent.
minute, wait a minute. What are the names of the arguments? So let's start off with that.
So the first argument is the class.
Okay.
Then the second argument are aggregations, and the third arguments are aggregators.
Oh my God. Okay.
I mean, aggregations, we can call it something else, but that's how I understand it.
Okay, so let's understand what those.
And the third argument is optional. So if you omit the third argument, you aggregate, you make one big group. It's like aggregating by true.
Okay, so what is an example of an aggregation?
Well, an aggregation is usually a string goes to an entity function, or maybe we can allow some naked aggregators.
So wait a minute, what does this mean? This means, so tell me again, in your own words, so to speak, what does aggregated entity class do? What is the one sentence summary?
It collapses a whole entity class in this two argument case into a single entity, into, let's say, a singleton entity class that contains a one entity containing aggregated properties of that class.
Okay, so collapses all entities in class
into essentially a single entity.
Into a single,
it's not
aggregated entity.
Yeah, well, yeah, correct statement would be that this is a singleton entity class, not a single entity.
Okay, right. Into a singleton entity class.
And that single entity would then, sorry.
Okay, hold on. And what happened to the, into a single entity class in which what happened to the properties?
Original properties are gone. And the new ones are the ones that
in which there are no original properties, but
yes,
there are new properties.
Yes,
given by the aggregation.
Defined from aggregation. The new properties defined from the aggregation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right, fine, I understand. So now let me understand the relationship between that and extended entity class. So let's write down a little bit about what happens here. So so categories of function. Oops. So what we're saying is there's a category of function that is creating one category of function creates a virtual entity class. See, I think there's going to be a mess here. Okay, so one thing is, so the first case is extended entity class. And what that does is adds some new computed properties to an existing entity class, correct? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, the next one, which I think is weird, because I think there's two different operations here which are being conflated into one.
Oh, they were separated. Then Tony insisted to merge them.
Okay, what were the separated ones?
I mean, they were called aggregated and aggregate by. One had
no, that's a different issue. I mean, because this aggregated entity class basically says, take the whole entity class, treat it as an entity. I understand it might be multiple ones, but let's not worry about that. Treat it as an entity with a new set of properties derived from the original entity class. Correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. What are some other cases here? So what is this one? Entity take. Okay. So entity take.
I mean, entity take. We have a new name for that, which could be something like bounded or sliced, because it's like you wanted a noun, an entity take. It's a verb. So it's like you're doing exactly like take.
Is it exactly like take based on the number, based on just taking the first n entities?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would like it to do up to automatically, because it's like would be a mess if it evaluates and if it returns a message or something like that. But
And it also can take not necessarily the first 10, it can take things from in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, just like take, you can take a list as a second argument.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's like take and up to maybe.
Let's try something like this. Not perhaps the best name, but that one is takes some.
I mean, it's a slice. You take from M to N, something like that.
Well, I don't know who calls that a slice.
Well, or it actually works a lot like span also in language.
Okay, where's the random one of these? How do I get a random set of things from an entity class?
Well, there's random entities.
So random entity, the function random entity.
Yeah.
Okay, so random entity, I would like to point out, is another resolver in our list of resolvers.
Yeah.
Right? Are we forgetting anybody else? So notice that random entity,
yeah.
You could end up with some very bizarre, lazy random entity. What the hell would that mean? Because there's two types, every time you call it, it's going to have a different, it's going to throw the dice differently. I have no idea what that means.
Also, throwing the dice in SQL is not completely trivial. We probably will not support it in version 1.
Well, on the server side.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Fine. But so this one is takes some set of parts in an entity class of the virtual list corresponding to an entity class, right? It's some kind of ordering.
Yeah, if you don't sort it before, you might get undefined behavior, depending on the backend.
Okay. So an alternative to this would be take some set of parts of the virtual list corresponding to an entity class and gives a new entity class with that reduced set of functionality, reduced set of elements, set of entities. Okay, so an alternative to this might be something like okay, so I'm just to give a name here. I mean, an alternative thing I think would be to be able to say, with a sorting criterion, okay, to be able to say something like, and then the number of elements. I'm thinking of look. This is like largest by.
Yeah, it's like largest by.
Actually, it's like take largest.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, you know what? We could like remove this and put it as an argument, as an optional argument to sort an entity class.
That's what I'm thinking.
Because you mostly don't want to do it unless you sorted before.
Right. Okay, so because it's like take largest by. Okay, so let's now write down the okay, so let's now the case of sorted entity class. The very same class, but with its ordering defined by a sorting criterion. And maybe only the first n elements extracted.
I think there is a deeper semantic problem here, because we never fixed the sorted nature of all entity classes that we're dealing with. And so if we don't say anything about it, then we can say what happens if you take sorted entity class and then, for example, do extend or do other things. So we really need to introduce some notion of being sorted or not as a property that can follow through in the query.
I don't understand why we need that.
Because in general, if you first do something like sort and then you do something like extend, then in general, you're not guaranteed that the extended thing is going to be sorted anymore. And I think it's quite unintuitive.
Why? I mean, is this an SQL implementation detail?
Yes, but also in our definitions, if we say that entity classes in general doesn't guarantee you the order, and all these transforms as well, then
But
even
we
in our
never said that it doesn't guarantee you the order. I think this is something that we have to fix in our implementation, but should not be a problem for the user. Like if SQL has this quirk, we should fix it.
It's not as simple as that, because sometimes you don't care about the order. And I mean,
if you don't care about the order, you don't care if you get it sorted.
No, it's an additional overhead, so you do care in that sense. But I think, maybe we can optimize that way. But my question is this: do we in general assume that entity class-like constructs are sorted?
Yes.
Okay, let's just have a quick look at some of these other things. By the way, someone on our live stream is asking about why can't they'd like to just query Wikidata and so on. You will be happy to know that in the new version, which I probably can't even pull up things for, we have a whole giant system. Great, that's still broken. Andrea, could you please report that again? That this is the prototype build, right? That I'm running. No, it's the head branch build. That it's not finding documentation in the head branch build.
Yeah, I already reported, but I will do it again then.
Well, can we find out what actually went wrong? Okay, so let's see, back to this. I was going to say that there's a new Sparkle whole system for doing Sparkle queries that's coming in version 12 that is yet again another separate, we've got Sparkle, we've got Mongo, we've got SQL, we've got dataset. It is a bit of a zoo, and it's very frustrating that, but I think all these things have different uses, and the Sparkle one is directly integrated with Entity Store, and in fact, you can basically treat it like a giant entity store, can't you? And now Tony has left, so he will be the one to really represent that. But let's just look at entity select or filtered entity class for a second and explain to me what. Okay, so I'm going to write that here because I think it's a little bit better defined. So filtered entity class gives a new entity class with the exact same entities.
No, not the exact same entities.
Well, with a subset, with a filtered set of entities. Okay, so but these entities still have the same types that they always have, don't they, or do they not?
That's the whole question. Like when they're sorted, when they're filtered, you could give them the same type, or you could want not.
This is Carlo. This is different. Sorted and filtered are two different cases, I think.
No, but why?
Because the existence in a sorted thing is never changing, but in a filter it is.
Yeah, but the order might.
The order, yes, but the order does not.
But I think it's the same thing. Like right now, the precedent that we have is like implicit entity class disappears the filter. But you might want the semantics of keeping the filter to know when an entity stops existing.
Yeah, but okay, so we've said this multiple times here. There is a notion of transformation functions which are symbolic and infinitely lazy. So we're agreeing that we want such things. But I'm saying, okay, your point is it isn't even defined what this entity class, what this new entity class is, until you run a resolver function on it, like entity list.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really matter. Still have the same if they get resolved. If they were immediately resolved without some other operation happening. Okay, so I think we understand that one. I'm not sure I'm okay. So what's the next one of these? Is this horrifically complicated, the join across case?
Yeah, it's not that complicated, but sure.
Okay, so explain to me, so with your notion of merged entity class, explain to me what is merged entity class.
So imagine, for example, you have all the countries and you want to merge the country properties with the city properties through the capital, so that you have this new mongrel entity, which is at the same time Italy and Rome.
So to think about it is to enhance, for example, the Rome properties with the properties of the country, Italy in this case.
Yeah, right. So merges in the properties from one entity class into another. Is that a reasonable way to say it?
Not quite, because this is the entity level operation. So it takes like entities, roughly speaking, you can say it takes entities of one class and adds to them properties of the other one. It's very precise either, but it's more precise than saying what you
okay,
just...
so you're saying that it merges into an entity class. Well, it actually, what it does, if I'm not mistaken, is it associates with entities in a given entity class, entities from another entity class. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, there is just one small thing. Like the case of country and capital city is simple. But if you take persons and books, one person might write many books and one book might be written by many people. And in that case, it has to multiply the rows. And so it's really, like, technically, it's really just a filtered version of the cross product. But
okay, but it associates with entities from another class, with entities in a given class, entities from another class. Is that correct?
Yes, but you can say that for each entity of one class, you can have several entities of the other class.
I understand.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe that a single entity in the first class is associated with many entities in the second one.
It could be also the other way around.
Right. Okay, listen, we did not resolve this today. Can we please pick this up again? I have to go to this machine learning meeting, so people on the live stream who are interested in machine learning, that is what we're about to cover. We just need to continue this. Sooner the better.
I would really prefer to have it sooner rather than later.
I understand. So let's try and get that.
Okay, I will try to get it this week. Again.
Yeah, maybe tomorrow. Even.
Okay, yes.
I will probably not be able to attend tomorrow.
Okay, well, you guys will broker the times. Okay. All right. Frustrating. We're not there yet. I think let's try to remember next time. I think this notion of transformation functions and resolution functions is a useful notion. I'm optimistic about that. Okay, and these names haven't made it yet for me, but let's keep pushing. All right, so people on the live stream, thanks for your participation, and we are going to, those interested in machine learning, we are about to talk about unsupervised machine learning functions in a couple of minutes. Thanks a lot, guys. See ya. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.